What is evolutionary psychology really? To have a clear idea how this is applied to the real world, there are other aspects of psychology that needs to be understood. Today, psychology is a scientific investigation of mental processes and behavior, but its root stems back to philosophy. Philosophical arguments have been around through human history and have survived because they have allowed people to better understand themselves and have set the agenda for many issues confronting psychologists to shed light on questions that seemed unanswerable for 2,500 years. The transition from philosophy to psychology in its infancy was non-scientific and relied heavily on clinical data. Philosophers searched for answers to questions about the nature of thought, feeling, and behavior in their minds using logic and argumentation. But by the late 19th century, a better approach emerged. Philosophers entered into a period of self-doubt, wrestling with the limitation of what they could know about morality, justice, and the nature of knowledge. Psychologists started applying these questions, investigating mind and behavior scientifically. Unlike physics and biology, psychology does not have a paradigm. A paradigm is a system of theoretical assumptions that the scientific community uses to make sense of its domain of study. Instead, psychology has schools of thought or perspectives. The earliest was the psychodynamic perspective by Sigmund Freud, that taught observations from thoughts, feelings, and needs are associated with the mind, and that many of these processes are unconscious, and that these processes can conflict with one another. Since psychoanalysis in the 1990s has passed scientific scrutiny, many of its theories continue to be studied today in professional and tertiary education. The same cannot be said about Carl Jung. From then on, the behaviorist perspective flourished by B.F. Skinner in the 19th century in how environmental elements control behavior, and they reject the concept of mind viewing mental events as something that cannot be known or studied scientifically. The decline of behaviorism began around the time of World War II. A large amount of research was being published on attention, the organization of memory, language, concept formation, problem solving, and new theories on child development. It was realized that such phenomena could not be studied within the confines of behaviorism. Complex human behavior is not readily explained using only the concepts from traditional behaviorist theory. Cognitive psychologists are interested in how people understand, diagnose, and solve problems, and are focused on the mental processes which mediate between stimulus and response. Interested in many of the questions Descartes put forth, creating a reasoning in mind that can arrive at knowledge independently of experience that behaviorists reject. And then there is the humanistic perspective, which is a shift away from science and focus more on unique experiences to fill their goals and is person-centered. And lastly, the last main perspective in psychology is evolutionary perspective. Psychologists who follow the evolutionary approach suggest that certain behaviors evolved because they help people to survive. For example, rather than seeing sex as an unconscious drive like Freud did, the evolutionary psychologists see the sexual impulse having a biological basis. These inborn processes seem as determining human behavior. Therefore, our evolutionary past may help us understand our present behaviors. Charles Darwin's ideas probably inspired the evolutionary perspective in psychology. He suggested that species survive if they can adapt to changes in the natural environment. Therefore, behaviors such as crying in young children when their mother leaves them is interpreted by evolutionary psychologists as a survival instinct. That is, there is a potential danger in young children not being protected, so over time children have adapted their caregiver leaving them by crying. Evolutionary psychologists are an example of those psychologists who are more affiliated with the nature or biological determined behavior rather than nurture or our environment side of the debate. Sociobiology is a relatively new and controversial field which explores possible evolutionary and biological basis of human social behavior. Primary methods of evolutionary approach are deductive and comparative, although evolutionary psychologists are increasingly relying on experimental methods. The basic notion of evolutionary theory is that evolution selects organisms to maximize their reproductive success, defined as the capacity to survive and reproduce, and to maximize the reproductive success of genetically related individuals.